Hey retro gamers. Today on Smashing Bricks, we do our best Frank Dukes impersonation and join an international martial arts competition in Street Fighter 2. Hey, welcome back to Smashing Bricks, a retro gaming podcast. This is episode 15. My name is Eddie Inzauto, and today I'm joined by returning guest Mark Besada from the Board Game Barrage podcast. Hey, Mark.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. I'm really excited for this one. This was a big moment in my video gaming career, so super pumped for this.
Nice. Yeah, me too. The excitement actually grew and grew as time went on, playing and researching and learning a lot about this Street Fighter 2 series.
Yeah, a lot of history, a lot of lore. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And it actually has got, not to spoil the episode, but it's gotten me excited to look into a lot more fighting games and more of the Capcom sort of history.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
I had a good time. Anyway, real quick, you're from the Board Game Barrage podcast, which we talked about the last time. Maybe just give the listeners an update so they can go check you out there before we get right into this.
Yeah, Board Game Barrage, we're still cranking out the episodes. We just hit our 5th year a couple weeks ago
Ooh.
of doing weekly episodes. And yeah, boardgamebarrage.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search us and we're there.
Great. Okay. Now I want to get into this quickly because there's a wealth of information here. We're talking about Capcom's Street Fighter 2, and we're talking about a number of iterations of this game that spanned many years in the 90s. So we're going to do our best to cover all of that. But to start, can you tell everyone who may not know, which I highly doubt, what Street Fighter 2 is?
Yeah, I would be shocked for anybody listening to a video game related podcast or even like a cultural podcast, anything doing with the 90s, not to know what Street Fighter was. Street Fighter was a one-on-one 2D fighting game where you picked a character that was from somewhere around the world. Each of them had special moves that you could sort of learn. I guess fighting game would be the classification of it, right? So when I think, not that I have an extensive knowledge of like the history of video games, but when I think video game, but especially when I think fighting game, this is like the prototypical game.
Yeah, me too. I think about it that way as well, and I think that sums it up. It is the fighting game. It maybe
absolutely
started the genre as we know it, I might say.
Yeah, certainly. I remember shortly thereafter, shortly after this game took off, seeing that genre sort of blow up, and seeing a lot of like games that were copying the style and copying a lot of the aesthetics. So yeah, it just seemed to be sort of groundbreaking in that genre for sure, and video games in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like many of the games that followed, it's basically one character on the left, one character on the right, either played by human players or the CPU. It was designed for the arcade, meant to be played head-to-head between two players, but it also had the arcade mode, quote unquote, where you just fight successive opponents till you get to the final boss, and then you beat the game. And that's really it. In the arcade, people were able to put in a quarter and play against whoever was on the machine at any time, and that was that. And then there would be a line behind that person waiting for their shot.
I remember. I still have very vivid memories of the arcades, and like you'd look down the aisle of all the games, and there would be like one or two games where there would just be crowds of people, and it was always Street Fighter 2.
Hmm. And did you know this game has a plot?
I remember. I mean, one of the big things for me in remembering the game was remembering the endings. I remember how I know. I think in retroactively they've added like a long plot that ties all the games together. But I do remember very clearly the endings for each character when you beat the Street Fighter 2 games. But yeah, I was aware of a plot as sort of like tenuous as it might be.
Yeah. Tenuous for sure. So yeah, each character when you beat the game, they had their little scene about what happened when they got to the end, why they were fighting was often involved in that. But the overarching story, which was basically nowhere in the game, is that the leader of the Shadow Lu organization, known as M. Bison in the American version and Vega in the Japanese version, in his global domination plan, sets up a fighting tournament to select the best fighters in the world to incorporate into his organization through brainwashing. And we don't know exactly how he plans to take over the world, but I guess that's the story.
M. Bison slash Vega played famously by Raul Julia in the movie, his last role.
Hmm. Yes, and what an amazing movie it was, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Yeah, as the all American. Yeah,
Yeah,
all
the
yeah.
muscles from Brussels. But
Right.
funnily enough, I was going to mention this later, but I did mention we do our best Frank Dukes impersonation in the intro, and that was referring to another Jean-Claude Van Damme film called Bloodsport,
Oh,
where the
okay.
main character was Frank Dukes, who went to fight in an underground tournament where each of the fighters was from a different country and they all fought with different styles. But anyway, that's Jean-Claude Van Damme. That was a great time in film with some definite Academy Award worthy movies.
Sure.
But this is Street Fighter 2. So let's get into the history for a moment here. So Street Fighter 2 is a huge series, and it feels like it spanned the entirety of gaming history. But in actuality, the count 'em, five main games came out within the span of 3 years. From 1991, February 1991, with the release of Street Fighter II, The World Warrior, all the way to February 1994, with the release of Super Street Fighter II Turbo. So we had World Warrior in February 91. This was on Capcom's CP System 1 arcade machine, which was the 14th game to use that. And some other games that were made using that system were Ghouls and Ghosts, Strider, Final Fight, 1941, Magic Sword, and some others. Following World Warrior in March of 92 was the game commonly known as Champion Edition. It was originally called Street Fighter 2 Dash, or 2 with a prime mark in Japan, but we came to know it as Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. And that had some updates. We'll talk about that later. Then in December 1992, particularly as a result of a lot of piracy of the Champion Edition, we had the release of Street Fighter 2 Hyper Fighting, which was called Street Fighter 2 Dash Turbo and more widely known as Street Fighter 2 Turbo, December 92. Then in September 93, we got Super Street Fighter 2, which added some more characters and changed up the system a little bit. It was built as the first game on Capcom's CP System 2, and that was followed by a turboified version of that game in February 1994 called Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Wow. They came so rapidly. I imagined it in my mind, in my memory, being a wider span of time. Did you have that sensation before looking into this?
Not really. I do have a very clear memory or feeling, at least I should say, of them all just coming. Like there was the initial Street Fighter 2, which I guess was known as World Warrior. And I remember that having like a little bit of time there, but then Champion Edition, all those other ones, I do remember them coming like hot and fast, like one
Mm,
after the other.
just rapid fire.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, maybe for me it was because I played World Warrior in the arcade probably early on, and then later I didn't play any of the other ones really in the arcade. I played on Super
Yeah.
Nintendo after that, and there was more of a delay, something like that. But anyway, so this game was made by Capcom, developed and published. Producer Yoshiki Akamoto, designers Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda, composers Yoko Shimomura, who actually only worked on the very first game and composed almost every single track for it, and then left Capcom to go to Square. And the other composer, Isao Abe, I don't know if that first name pronunciation is right, but this person went on to be a composer on all the rest of the games. And the team was pretty much the same the whole time, except for, as I said, the composers. And when Super came around, they got a new-ish team with designer Noritaka Funamitsu and Haruo Murata, with Funamizu having been a sort of special producer on the first one, getting a special thanks credit on World Warrior. So is the people, and the entire team was about 35 to 40 people. Now, did you know about the original Street Fighter game?
I did. I know that in doing research, I know that it was released on a number of different consoles, but I only knew it from playing it in. This is funny. So I only knew it from the arcade, which I
Mm-hmm.
played after Street Fighter Two came out. So I don't know if this was. This was a 7-Eleven, believe it or not. So there was a 7-Eleven next to the church we'd go to, and we would go to church, and then we would go to the 7-Eleven, and they had a original Street Fighter machine. I don't know if like the owner of the that branch of the 7-Eleven thought that he was getting Street Fighter 2. He heard the news and accidentally got the original Street Fighter, but for some reason they had the Street Fighter 1 machine in there. And I remember initially thinking of Street Fighter 2, being really excited, and then going and, oh, this is actually Street Fighter the original. I'm like, oh, let's try it out. Let's see what it's like. See if it's like Street Fighter 2, which it is. It is not for the most part. Like, it definitely is a one-on-one fighting game, but it's a much slower version of it. So didn't give us what we were looking for, but it was interesting to try. And in doing research for this, I got a chance to play it again, and yeah, doesn't give you what you want in a Street Fighter game, but it's still interesting for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, that game was pretty different. It was before they even created the CP System 1, and it was built off of the director of that game's prior work, Kung Fu Master, which people might know as Kung Fu for the Nintendo Entertainment System, but the arcade
which
version.
which I remember very, very fondly. I remember Kung Fu on the original NES. And again, in doing research for this and hearing about those ties, like when you think about them one after the other, and you sort of see them side by side, you can definitely see the influence quite
Hmm.
strongly.
A little bit of an evolution. He decided he wanted to focus on like the boss fights, and that's how they came up with the just one-on-one. But it was a lot less smooth. It was a little more choppy, hard to play, very hard to win, as I remember it.
Yeah.
But in any case, this kind of laid the foundation for every 2D fighting game ever made after that. The original Street Fighter was first made with two pressure sensitive buttons, like a big punch button and a smaller kick button. And I believe you had to hit it harder for like a
Yeah.
fierce punch or
It's
lightweight for a
wild. Yeah.
jab. And it was not popular at all. So
No,
they changed it to a 6-button arcade setup, which became much more popular. And it sold, like, some estimates say, up to 50 times as many arcade cabinets as the pressure sensitive one, which is crazy and obvious. Like, of course it would be.
right.
That pressure sensitive idea was
People just
interesting to say the least.
banging away at the arcade just seems ridiculous.
I wonder if those machines broke a lot from people trying to hit
That's
it
what I
really
heard.
hard.
Yeah, yeah. I was doing again research on this, and yeah, it seemed like there was a lot of upkeep. People were like, I read somewhere that people were getting so tired of like continuously punching that they would like use their feet because they're just getting worn out playing this game.
Oh my god. So that wasn't super successful, but the button setup was kind of a first, the 6 buttons. And then following that, Capcom saw great success with Final Fight, which was its 7th CPS game, so kind of halfway to Street Fighter. And that inspired them to build off of that success, revive the idea of the original Street Fighter, but as a better playing game with a new team behind it. And as I said, this was 35 to 40 people, and they worked for about 2 years with a budget of around $2.5 million, which sounds like a lot to me for then.
Yeah, that's what I would have assumed.
Mm. And as they were making it, they said that balance was not a high priority, balance between characters, but the animations of the characters was absolutely a priority,
Right.
which makes a lot of sense because the game has really good animations. The graphics were what drew me in as a child. I remember while I was playing this time, I had vivid recollections of seeing, for example, the Blanca sprite and using
Absolutely.
that at the
Yeah.
arcade and that I felt the feeling of seeing it again. It was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the Blanca, the charging move, and yeah, just that was again, yeah, one of the most evocative moments of this recent playthrough again for me was seeing that and remembering how I felt as a kid. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, it was really cool. The combos, which are a very important part of essentially all fighting games going forward through history, was originally a bug that was discovered via a play session and just left in. And combos being when you hit certain buttons or perform certain attacks in rapid succession with the proper timing, the subsequent attacks are not blockable or cancelable, which seems like a really cool accident.
Right. Yeah.
But again, because the first version was not developed with balance in mind, they had to make 4 more versions as the game grew in popularity. And when Capcom first introduced this game, they introduced it as their greatest video game ever, which turned out to be very prophetic.
Yeah. That's funny.
And yeah, it's amazing where they went from here. And I think a really important part of this was the accuracy of the inputs. The gameplay was notably excellent for the time due to what was considered the most advanced and accurate joystick and button scanning routine ever made up until 1991 when the game came out.
I remember this part of the game really clearly because although I played the game quite a bit, it was my brother who was really excelled. My brother was 2 years younger than me, so he must have been something in the neighborhood of like, I don't know, 8 or 9 at the time when the game came out, and he was like a Street Fighter 2 savant. Like we would go to arcades, and he was this little kid, and like grown men would just put in quarter after quarter trying to play him, trying to beat him, and he was just. I don't know where he got it from, but I do remember like watching him play and trying to figure out why he was so much better than me and better than most people. And the way that it almost went from like, and this is sort of like maybe a little too fancy way to describing it, but like it almost felt like it was going from like what he wanted to do in his brain, like what he could just sort of like do it with his hands and it immediately got on the screen. Like there was some level of like a really strong flow state that I think Street Fighter 2 players could get into, as opposed to like, for example, Street Fighter, the original Street Fighter, which was like you would press a button or you do something on the joystick and it would be very plodding. But with Street Fighter 2, like it went from your brain to your hands to the screen in like in an instant. I remember that being a really striking part of it.
Yeah, the original almost felt like you had to get lucky that the game realized you did what you did with the controls.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas Street Fighter 2 was very, very responsive. And it became a pretty massive success right away in the arcades. I'm going to jump to sales here. And this is a statistic that is mind blowing. All versions of Street Fighter 2 are estimated to have grossed a total of $10.6 billion in revenue. That's billion with a B.
That is insane. Wow.
It's basically the highest grossing video game of all time outside of a couple others from the golden era of arcades in the late 70s and early 80s. When you consider the quarters put into it, as well as the arcade units purchased and all the home ports purchased. It has a lot of different ways of achieving revenue.
Right.
Which is just amazing. If we jump to the Super Famicom version, that sold 1 million copies in the first 2 weeks in Japan at the equivalent of $85. Which is nuts in 1991. And there was a stock shortage because it was so popular. So the games started selling as high as $119 equivalent. I don't know what it is in yen, but we understand dollars. Similarly, in the United States, the Super Nintendo cart launched at $74.99. And it still sold 750,000 copies in the first 2 months. And 2 million by the end of 1992 in North America.
This is another aspect of the game that I remember so clearly. I remember
the price.
No, not the price. My dad paid for it. I didn't care about the price. But I remember like hearing it must have been in like Electronic Gaming Monthly or one of those video game magazines that I was subscribed to. Hearing that Street Fighter 2 was coming out on the Super Nintendo, and I was like, it was like. It blew my mind that this experience could be something we could do at home potentially. And I remember like them announcing the day you could sign up to buy the game. And I remember we went to the Electronic Boutique, which was a video game store that's long defunct. And I remember getting a call from them the night before saying, you know, our order was in and we could pick it up. And I think they even like opened the store a couple hours early because they knew just like how in demand it was. And I have a really strong memory of like waking up at like 6 o'clock or something and going to the mall, and like there was no other stores open except for this Electronic Boutique, and there was a line of kids out to get it. And just I just such a visceral memory of having that cartridge and having that game and driving home and thinking like, we are about to play Street Fighter 2 at my house. That was just like, I could not believe that was a thing that you could do.
Yeah, that must have been crazy. A big change, I imagine, coming from the arcade back to home. And then...
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was recognized by basically every gaming publication that there was at the time. So as far as like review scores, there weren't many for the arcade. That just wasn't a thing. Publications didn't review arcade games. But one example is Computer and Video Games rated at a 93%. But then the SNES version really kicked off a new kind of era of Street Fighter and it being more well known by more people. And here we see scores like 35 out of 40 from Famitsu, 9.5 at EGM, 5 out of 5 from GamePro, 9 out of 10 at Edge, and many others in the 90 to 100% range. And then it also received Game of the Year from numerous publications, some examples being Gamist in Japan, the Electronic Gaming Awards, EGM, European Computer Trade Show, Golden Joystick Awards, GameFan, Game Informer, GamePro, Nintendo Power, where it beat Nintendo's own Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past in their year-end awards, which is crazy to me.
It is crazy.
And of course, the Chicago Tribune gave it Game of the Year because they had a Game of the Year award, apparently. So it was a success. It was a smash hit critically and commercially. and that led to clones, quote unquote Street Fighter clones. It was the explosion of the fighting game scene. We had numerous companies trying to make their own version, their own Street Fighter. They wanted a piece of this. Do you remember seeing all of the different fighting games that just exploded onto the scene at this point?
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about the big rival that would eventually come out to it and would legitimately rival the popularity of Street Fighter. But yeah, I remember uh, Killer Instinct was one. I remember there was a big like focus on combos and that kind of thing. But yeah, I do. I remember just like a lot, and a lot of them would just fade out. Like when you had the opportunity to play Street Fighter, like why would you play the knockoff? But of course, there
Yeah.
was one that did challenge it, and I guess continues to challenge it.
Yeah. We'll talk about them right now, real quick. One company that did really well, I think, as far as fighting games are concerned, was SNK. That's the company that made the Neo Geo. But because of the way the SNK arcade systems and the Neo Geo home console were sort of consumed, maybe it was a more niche market because the Neo Geo cost roughly $700 million. But they had a series of games. First, the Fatal Fury series, starting with Fatal Fury in 1991, which was made by the original Street Fighter 1987 designer, Takashi Nishiyama. So he went on to work at SNK and start making games there. And then Fatal Fury 2, Special, and 3 came out in 92, 93, and 95. Art of Fighting 1 and 2 came out in 92 and 94. World Heroes 1, 2, Jet, and Perfect in 92, 3, 4, and 5. And Samurai Showdown, a very cool game, in 1993. And that's just all from SNK. But here we have, coming up next, one of the big rivals, probably the one you're talking about, Mortal
Yeah,
Kombat in 1992.
yeah, I remember that one hitting the arcades in a very similar way to the original Street Fighter Two. I remember that being a big hit.
Mm-hmm. And that was big because it had sort of digitized, quote unquote, photorealistic graphics. It had lots of blood and it had fatalities,
Yep.
which Street Fighter did not have. And they had tons of sequels. Mortal Kombat 2 and 3 came out in 93 and 95. And Mortal Kombat, like you said, persists today as a rival. I was never personally into Mortal Kombat because while the fatalities were cool, it just didn't have the play control.
Yeah,
It didn't
agreed.
have that tight gameplay. But anyway, many people love it, and many people love it more than Street Fighter. Some other games were Fighter's History in 93, Power Instinct 1 and 2 in 93 and 94, Eternal Champions, which was a Sega game, in 93, Killer Instinct 1 and 2, like you mentioned, in 94 and 95, and there was even a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Tournament Fighters game in 1993. And this large list I just read off is not even the tip of the iceberg. There were hundreds of
Yeah,
fighting
for
games
sure.
at this time. I remember one I had called Doomsday Warrior on the Super Nintendo. I mentioned it once before because I traded it away in exchange for Donkey Kong Country, which was
Oh,
the best trade in the history of video game trades.
yeah, it seems
Something
like a
that
big
you
win there
appreciate,
for
I'm
sure.
sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that game was so terrible, but it looked like mature, and it was part of the fighting game hype. So I leveraged all that to get myself a copy of Donkey Kong Country, which
Nice.
was great. And there are more and more of these fighting games for the rest of the 90s and forever. Till now there's still so many 2D fighting games and now 3D fighting games. Last little bit here is the wealth of ports and re-releases and the overall legacy. So Street Fighter 2 has been released on nearly every single platform ever, numerous times in many different ways. So if you look for it, you'll find it. But just quickly, World Warrior was ported directly to the Super Nintendo, DOS, Amiga, Atari ST, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, CPS, Game Boy, Sega Master System, and some others. Champion Edition was on the TurboGrafx 16, Genesis, the Sharp X6800, SMS, the Sega Master System. Hyper Fighting, which is Turbo, Super Nintendo, Genesis, the 360 on XBLA, and it made it onto the SNES Classic. Super Street Fighter 2 was released on the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, and some other collections we'll get to. And Super Turbo on the 3DO, Amiga, DOS, and Dreamcast. Wow. Now, there are a number of compilations that are really awesome, because while some of these original ports are okay, and they were reviewed really well, like the Super Nintendo one, for example, they were not arcade perfect. And I didn't realize that at the time, because when you're in the arcade, you see it, and then you come home on the Super Nintendo, you see it, and you're not looking at them side by side, and they just feel the same. And I think a lot of reviewers said it was about as good as you're going to get. Could you perceive a difference when you were younger between the home and the arcade versions?
Yeah, there was definitely like a more of a more of like a gloss, more there was more resolution. There was the graphics I remember being just clearly a step better. And the controls were maybe a little bit worse than the arcade, but again, we were just so excited to have this at home that we very easily looked past it. But yeah, there was definitely a drop in quality, but not a major one. It was a really good port of the arcade for sure.
Yeah, talking specifically about that Super Nintendo version,
Super Nintendo,
which is what you experienced. Yeah, me too. And I mean, obviously, you were playing with a Super Nintendo controller and not an arcade stick, unless you had the Super Nintendo stick, which I don't think was actually very good, but it gave you that vibe.
Yes, right.
But better ports existed later on more powerful systems. And this is where we get the compilations. In 1997, there was a Street Fighter collection for PlayStation and Saturn that included Super and Super Turbo, and these are nearly arcade perfect. Same thing with 1998's Capcom Generations 5 Street Fighter Collection 2, also for PlayStation and Saturn, although the Saturn one only came out in Japan. And this had the first 3 games in it, also pretty much arcade perfect. And I realized this when I played this time. They're so good. Oh my God. Yeah. Later on, 2005, we had the Capcom Classics Collection, Volume 1. And then 2006, we had Volume 2 and Reloaded. And between those, we got all 5 of the original games in Volumes 1 and 2. And then for Reloaded, that was for the PSP, and that had the first 3 games, the non-Super ones. And then much later in 2018, we got a 30th anniversary collection for even newer systems, PS4, Xbox One, Switch, and PC, which you can buy very easily today, which has all 5 of the main versions of Street Fighter, plus Street Fighter 1, I think all of the Alpha games, and the Street Fighter 3 games. So that is a cool way to have all these games. I haven't actually played it, but I assume it probably plays perfectly. These are very powerful systems at this point.
Yeah.
I actually, having gone through this process, I might even want to get that for the Switch.
Yeah.
Or for the PC, maybe. I don't know. A couple of other ones that were released were 2003's Hyper Street Fighter 2, the Anniversary Edition, which I literally have never heard of until playing for this show. So this one's super cool. This came out for the PS2 originally, PlayStation 2, and was quickly ported to the arcade as the final CPS2 game for Capcom. And in this one, you could choose any version of any fighter in the series, meaning you could have Ryu from World Warrior, or any of the characters from World Warrior, and fight against your friend who's using maybe Guile from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo in the same battle, fighting against each other. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah. This was only released on the Street Fighter Anniversary Collection disc for PS2 and obviously in the arcade, and it was later ported to the Xbox. Finally, though, it was released just last year in the Capcom Fighting Collection on PS4, Xbox One, Switch, and PC. Again, another easy way to play these games. 2008, we had Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo HD Remix, which I think you said you played on
Yes.
PSN and XBLA. And that one, what? It's the same as Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, but with updated graphics and sound.
Yes, I'm sure the sound was also better, but the graphics are pretty striking. Yeah.
There was one of them, I think this might be it, had overclocked remix tunes added to the game.
Yeah, I think this is the one.
And that pretty much covers. Oh, there's one more. 2017 Ultra Street Fighter 2 The Final Challengers for the Nintendo Switch, which I didn't know existed until yesterday, which added even more characters to the roster, making it the biggest roster for a Street Fighter 2 game yet, and presumably the final version, if we can believe them. So those are all the games, and we got 2 movies, the aforementioned Street Fighter with Jean-Claude Van Damme, which I think was terrible.
Yeah.
And Street Fighter 2, the animated movie, which I've heard really good things about.
Same.
Did you
Yeah,
ever see that?
I've heard good things, but I've not watched it. No.
Did you ever watch the 1995 to 1997 cartoon Street Fighter?
I did not.
Me either. It has like a G.I. Joe look to it. Just looking at the pictures. Just reminds me
Seems
of
like
that style.
If that had come out like 5 years earlier, I've been right in my sweet spot probably.
Yeah. Some other things to note about Street Fighter 2. It was recognized in the Guinness Book of World Records Gamers Edition 3 times as the first game to use combos, the most cloned fighting game, and the biggest selling coin-operated fighting game. So the Guinness Book of World Records. It's also in the Strong National Museum of Play's Video Game Hall of Fame. Street Fighter 2 is there. And it's been noted among the most influential games of all time. And pretty much any place that has ever had a list of this type has included Street Fighter 2 among the best games of all time.
Yeah, got to. I assume you have to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. It almost single-handedly kept the arcades alive. You know, when it was released, we were seeing a decline in arcades and going more toward the home console end of the video game hobby. But fighting games in particular were really instrumental in keeping the arcades relevant. And a lot of that is thanks to this game right here.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, firsthand experience. I remember, me and my friends would go through a ton of, NES games, and you'd have thought that would be, satisfy us, but we would spend a ton of time in the arcades, and especially, again, Street Fighter 2 would dominate for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So we talked a little bit about our histories. You mentioned your savant brother. Anything else worth mentioning about your prior relationship with the game?
Street Fighter 2 was such a huge part of our lives in a way that's sort of weird to think about looking back, but that game was massive. And and again, my brother, we would go to the mall, and you could drop him off at the arcade with $1, and he was just so good at the game that he could just stay there all day with a buck or two and just take on all comers. It was crazy.
Yeah. Oh wow, that just like unlocked a memory for me. Dropping me off with a little bit of money and being able to play for a long time. So
yeah.
I'm not a savant at any video game.
Neither
except maybe GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64. But I was pretty good at Street Fighter 2, the original one in the arcade. Me and my friend George, who was on the Punch-Out episode, we both had a similar experience at our local Playland arcade, where we would stand on essentially like a hotel chair that was there and play the game with full-on adults and older teenagers, whatever, and win over and over. and everyone would be like, "Yo, Shorty's got moves." And I remember being able to win a lot, and I wasn't doing anything special. I was just kind of outpacing my opponents, but it
Yeah.
felt really good to be standing there at the machine and watch other people come up, try to fight me, and fail over and over. And I could play for a long time on a quarter. That was really cool.
My two most vibrant Street Fighter 2 in the arcade memories are, one, I remember going into the local arcade and they had attached these little like quarter holders on the top
Mm,
of the machine, sort of like in the top part of the glass. So like if you were next, or if you want to be next, you would reserve a spot by putting your quarter in one of these slots. And I'd
mm-hmm.
never seen anything like that. And it's just like, wow, this game is crazy popular. People would be reserving like being next by putting their quarter up on these like things that they'd attach to the games. And then the other, again, another reference to my brother. I remember him. He was just creaming people at this arcade, and there was this guy. He must have been, I don't know, 30-year-old guy with a big cigar. And I just remember him being so frustrated. And my brother didn't see this at the time because he was so focused on playing. But the guy would like blow smoke out of the corner of his mouth to sort of like try to make my brother like have to turn away or not say. It didn't help the guy. He still got cream, but I just remember how frustrating he was to these older kids.
Oh my god. That's that's such a dirtbag move.
Yeah, I mean, back in the day when you could, smoke playing in arcades, and it was crazy. Yeah,
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I guess it must have been frustrating. You can either play once for a quarter, or you could be good enough to maybe even beat the game, right? On a quarter.
right,
But
right.
if one person is better than you one time, you're off.
You're off, and then you got to wait in line to get back on because there's
Yeah,
such a
it's not
demand
only
for it.
the
That yeah,
money, the time, the
yeah,
time waiting. Yeah, that's nuts. That's really interesting about the quarter thing too. That reminds me of a pool table, which was
yes,
always funny to
exactly.
me because you don't know whose quarter is whose.
Right, exactly. I didn't get it, but I just knew it was a sign that this game's real
Yeah.
popular.
I guess the sorts of fights that you might see breaking out in a bar over that sort of a thing wouldn't happen in an arcade as much with the lack
Right,
of inebriation going on.
right.
What else? Yeah, so I also played this game at some other locations like the bowling alley. That was one when my dad had his bowling league. I would go and this game was there and I would play it. And Sunset Riders was another big one at that location. And you mentioned Street Fighter earlier. I also played Street Fighter at a convenience store. There's this local store. It was basically this country convenience store, and they had maybe two games, or maybe it was just Street Fighter 1 with the buttons, not with the pressure sensitive punch pads. And that game demolished me every time. I did not like it. I love the idea of it, but that was about it.
Right, right. Yeah, as I said, I remember playing Street Fighter 1 at a 7-Eleven, which just seems crazy thinking back to it. And then there was, obviously, we played Street Fighter 2 at a ton of different arcades around the area. But we also, there was a newspaper stand that we would go to that had a couple arcades, and one of them was Street Fighter. And this was like a really nice place for us because it was close by. And our dad would be happy to take us there because he would, you know, give my brother and me a couple bucks, and we would be playing for hours, and my dad could just like sit around and chat with his friends and read the paper. So I just remember that being a big thing too.
Hmm. Sounds like a nice chill time with the kids.
Yeah.
I like that. Go dad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the arcade. And then as far as a further experience with the game, my friends George and Brian had the World Warrior cartridge for the Super Nintendo, and I would be over at their place all the time playing that game. And we would play against each other. My cousin Joe would come over and play also. And that was a huge deal, just sitting there one on one. It was perfect with the Super Nintendo controllers. And it was just a great time. And then finally I got my own version of the game when I put Super Street Fighter 2 on layaway at the local department store. It was probably a $75 game also. and brought in like $5 at a time for a long time until I
Right.
got it. And then I brought that one home and I played the heck out of it at home. Just like solo whenever I could, or 2-player when my friends were around. But after that, that was really it. I just kind of fell off of fighting games after that. And then we got into like Mario 64 and Zelda Ocarina of Time, and I shifted to, those epic experiences, I guess.
Yeah, sort of similar. Sort of similar with me. Like it was Street Fighter 2 dominating for a long time, and then there were the offshoots, the other versions of Street Fighter 2, and then I remember playing a couple of the ones, the clones, like the Killer Instinct and even a little bit of Mortal Kombat, but it didn't really stick around the same way none of those games did, and sort of then off to other games.
Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting time, the early 90s, and
Yeah.
2D fighting games. That was the thing in the video game hobby at that time, more than anything else, I think.
Right.
As far as I remember. But now we have played the game again in preparation for this episode. And I don't know about you, but I played a lot of different versions. What did you play?
Yeah. So I played World Warrior. I played the Champion Edition. I played a Street Fighter the Rainbow Edition, which I guess was a illegal, like hacked version. But I remember that coming out in the arcade and being sort of blown away by that because it was really janky. Like you could tell that this wasn't like a full Capcom release because it was just the way it played was weird. But you could switch characters in the middle of the game, like as you were fighting, you could go from one character to another, and it had like homing fireballs, like your fireball would like follow somebody across the board. It was just really weird, but it was sort of an insight into hacked games that I wasn't aware of.
Got it. Yeah, I read about that, but I didn't read that it had a particular name until just before the show. You mentioned the Rainbow Edition. I was like, I don't know what that is. But yeah, there were a lot of those.
Yeah, I think that's what we called it. I don't even remember it being like a name that they added to the screen or anything. I think people would call it the Rainbow Edition. I think because some of the graphics were different at the beginning and it just like had a rainbow or something. But anyway, then I played the Super Street Fighter Turbo edition, and then the Turbo Remix. I did a little bit of that too.
Oh wow! So the majority of them, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I wanted to dabble in a little bit of each if I could.
Yeah, I did the same. Just to quickly touch on that Rainbow Edition, hundreds of thousands of these counterfeit arcade cabinets were made and distributed worldwide, a lot of them out of Taiwan. And this is what inspired Capcom actually to release Hyper Fighting, aka Turbo, because the counterfeiters couldn't emulate or recreate the sped up version of the game. And that became sort of the de facto version for a really long time.
Right. I mean, there was so much money, I'm sure, flooding into that game that it's easy to see why it was a target to pirates for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So you played World Warrior on both an arcade version and the Super Nintendo version?
Yeah.
So how'd that go for you?
It was great. Just how interesting the different characters were. Like, the Blanca with the electricity power and obviously Ryu and Ken with the classic, fireball and dragon punch and hurricane kick. It's such an amazing like mixture of characters. I loved it.
Did you have a favorite character back in the day in the arcade or at home or both? And did that change over time? And who did you like when you came back to it now? And did that change from version to version?
I sort of had three characters. So I had like, okay, if I needed to win the game, like if I was playing my brother or something where I didn't really have a chance, but I just wanted to somehow try to get a cheap win, I would usually go like Honda. Because I try to get my opponent like cramped in a corner and then do the slap, like I forget what the move is called, but like the 1,000
100
slaps
hand
thing.
slap.
The 100 hand slap, right? I also liked how Honda had that thing where he could shoot himself across the screen, so he had like a ranged attack sort of
Mm-hmm.
thing. So he was my go to for a win. My if I was trying to get fancy, I liked Chun Li. I just how
Okay.
aerobatic she was really cool. I always loved that. And then uh, if I ever tried, like if I wanted to try to get better, I would go with Ken because my brother was a big Ryu person, and I feel like
Mm-hmm.
the like if you were good with Ryu, it was sort of like a claim, like it was like a claim that you were like a good Street Fighter character. Like you were really good with like the main guy. So I didn't want to be that, but Ken was just a palette swap, so it wasn't like I was doing anything like controversial or anything like that crazy. But I wanted to be the Ken guy because there wasn't very many Ken guys around when I was playing. So
Mm.
Ken was my character of choice.
Yeah, I mean they were basically the same in the first game. Supposedly, like Ken was a little faster and Ryu was a little stronger, or the other way around, or
I think it
something.
was the other way around. Yeah, I
Yeah,
remember hearing rumors about that. Like,
I don't know if
Ken,
that
if
was
you look,
true.
I don't think it. I think it probably wasn't.
I think that's one of those kid things, right, where they
Yes,
just make up a
exactly,
story.
exactly. Like, hey, if you look at the bar, look, it actually goes a little bit more when you go with Ken. If if you punch with Ryu, it's like a little bit faster if you actually really look at it. But I don't think it was actually anything to it.
Yeah. The only real differences I remember is basically just one, was when you do the strong kick, the roundhouse grab, Ryu would
Right.
just kick the guy over his back, and Ken would do an extra flip and then throw the guy.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah.
But that's really it in the first version. And I feel like they were both there because you could not choose the same character as one another in that first game. So they put
Right.
like the main guy, and both players could be the main guy. I feel like they were really good. They've always been really good. But I felt like in the original game, Guile was a god. For whatever reason, I
Yeah.
was so good with Guile. There were things about him, like you could grab from almost a full sprite away. Like he had an insane reach with his back suplex move, and it was just so
Yeah.
easy to grab your opponents. And he had the jumping backbreaker and the jumping throw that you could always connect with, because I think maybe this grab range extended in the air. And I apologize to anyone who's listening and thinking I'm an idiot and that we're both idiots as we talk about these games, because we're not super aficionados, but this is just how it felt to me. And it
Yeah.
may be right, it may be wrong, whatever. I'm trying it.
I remember a Guile had that broken thing where you could, it was called, I guess called the handcuffs, where you could sort of like lock an opponent if you hit things right. I don't remember what it took to do it, but I remember that being like sort of like a cheat there you could do.
Yeah, I read about that, but I'd never heard of it before and never done it. And I don't think it's even really beneficial, cuz I think it's almost like a game-breaking glitch where you can't
Yeah.
kill them after
Yeah, I
that.
think it was maybe in the first round of the arcade, like the original
Mm.
Street Fighter 2
Yeah,
had it, but I think they got it out earlier.
right. The original World Warrior had a bunch of different glitches, which they quickly changed in the Champion Edition that next year. One thing they lost in the subsequent editions was the sounds where you would shoot Hadoukens or Sonic Booms or Yoga Fire or any of those projectiles, and they would be yelled at a different pitch for the different strengths, which was
Right.
sort of a tell for how fast they would be coming, which I thought was a really cool addition, but they took it out. I guess what they
Yeah,
want is for it to be a fake out as opposed to a telegraph.
that makes sense, but that change in pitch was such a like ingrained part of the original experience for me. I remember that being like something that was part and parcel to the Street Fighter experience, such that the different ways the
Hmm.
announcer would call things.
Yeah, it seems like every little change was just more of the balancing, and
Yeah.
they were just sort of strengthening those projectile characters by making it harder to read those moves. What else? So that game, I found the four bosses, like the Shadow Lu bosses, super tough. That
Oh
would
yeah.
be Balrog, Vega, Sagat, and M. Bison. I had so much trouble with Vega forever. Like, did you have a particular character that always killed you?
Yeah, I don't know if I ever beat the game like back in the day, and even now I had to like cheat my way around it. But yeah, no, I remember Balrog. I was able to get past, but yeah, Vega was really hard, and Sagat, forget about it. I and the times I remember definitely, like my brother would get to the last guy, get to like M Bison. And he would, let me play it because I was never going to get there on my own, and just getting creamed, like just thinking it was impossible.
Mm, yeah, so hard. Yeah, Vega got me all the time. That stupid move where he would jump on the back fence and then jump off and hit you or suplex you. So hard
Right.
to dodge. And then M. Bison, too, doing the Psycho Crusher constantly back and forth and jumping on your
Yeah.
head. Nuts. Although I like the diversity in all those moves and like each character having sort of special things about them that they could do, like jumping off the sidewall for Chun-Li and stomping on your head, and what else? The midair throw for Guile, and like all these weird different things that are beyond just the command focused moves. Super
Yeah,
cool.
absolutely. That's one of the highlights of the game for sure. Like Dalsum and the stretched
Hmm.
attacks and all that stuff. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah. As for those four bosses, I kind of vaguely alluded to it earlier, but the names were different. And that's because Balrog was originally called M. Bison or Mike Bison, like Mike Tyson. And they were afraid that bringing it to the United States could open them up for a likeness infringement suit by Mike Tyson. So they switched around all the names, and the main boss, Vega, became M. Bison, and Mike Bison, the boxer, became Balrog, and Balrog, the guy with the claws, became Vega. And I thought that's so funny. I wonder what would
Yeah,
have
what?
happened if they left it.
Why not? Yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's interesting to think about. But why, if you're gonna make the main bot, like if you're gonna make that, take the name and put it over to the main boss, why not just call him Bison? Why keep the M there? It's just such a weird thing.
I wonder if he would have sued them or if he just wouldn't have even cared. He probably would have been so hyped and played the game himself, I bet. Now that
Sure.
we know Mike Tyson's personality a bit more over the last 40 years, I bet
Yeah.
he would be down. So, the Champion Edition, not a lot of differences between the Champion Edition, right?
Well, the Champion Edition was the one, unless I'm mistaken, was the one where you could play as the four bosses.
Oh, they brought it in for
Which,
that. That's right.
yeah,
Yeah. And
that
that was
was
super cool.
super cool. I remember that really clearly. Like, what, you can play as Bison and Vega and Sagat? Is like, wow, that's awesome. Yeah, that was
Yeah,
huge.
you know what? I do remember one day I went and played Street Fighter 2 and I didn't realize it had a different subtitle and I saw the four characters and I was shocked.
Yeah,
And that was amazing. Really cool. But it was still the same speed. And
right.
there were like only slight tweaks to the gameplay, like a little bit of balancing between characters. So that's pretty cool. Was there a particular one that you wanted to go to more than the others?
I mean, obviously, you want to gravitate towards Bison because he's like the boss, and he has like that,
Hmm.
all the like electric sort of things. But I remember being really disappointed, and it was sort of like the Zangief thing. Like Zangief looks like such a cool guy and like
Hmm.
so strong and stuff, but in actuality, doesn't really. I didn't know many people who
He's
were
hard
like
to play.
excelling. Yeah, it's Zangief, and the same thing was with happened with Balrog. Because I don't
Yeah.
think he didn't like all his buttons. Whereas with most characters, you have three punch buttons and three kick buttons. All his buttons, I think, were all punches because
Hmm.
keeping with the boxer thing.
Yep.
So that was sort of kept me away from really playing him. But the other ones I loved.
Yeah, I was super drawn to Balrog also. I wanted to use him. The boxer was cool,
Yeah.
but he's just so hard to use and he had a lot of those charge moves where you had to hold down
Yes.
buttons that,
Right.
by the way, the game could unleash those rapid fire and that's cheating. You
Right.
ever
Right.
ever notice that? You could just do
Oh
those
yeah,
over and
absolutely.
over so fast, and in reality for the player, you have to hold those for at least two
Hold it.
seconds.
Yeah.
It's messed up. So yeah, regular game. Oh, you could do mirror matches in Champion Edition, which is cool.
Right.
Yeah. So this time around, I also tried out the Genesis edition along with the Super Nintendo edition, and I found a great difference between the two.
Interesting.
This is one of those shining examples of the console wars in full effect, and pretty much an objective reality between the two consoles. What do you think I discovered?
I am going to guess that you discovered that the Genesis controls were better.
No. But that actually might be true because Genesis had the 6-button controller,
Right.
and the 6-button controller was actually released for this game.
Oh, did not
That's
know that.
another example of the influence that this game had on gaming history. So the Genesis version was actually the Champion Edition. So maybe it was a little bit improved over the SNES World Warrior Edition, just with the basic inclusions of things. But the Super Nintendo also had Street Fighter II Turbo, and those are the two that I kind of compared directly. And I found that the graphics and the audio were both superior in the Super Nintendo. And I think this was part of the reason back in the day that I felt so strongly about this console war, because this was such a big game and it was so in the limelight that it was obviously going to be compared. And it really shows off how the Super Nintendo has more colors, it had smoother gradients, and the better sound chip. As a matter of fact, the Genesis versions of all the ensuing games, just the sound was just a little grating. It was like kind of
Hmm.
hard to listen to, crunchy, noisy, very, yeah. So Super Nintendo versions were superior to the Genesis versions for me on this replay, but they were still both kind of less than the arcade.
Sure. Yeah.
Did you play Turbo?
I did play Turbo. Yeah, and which is basically, I think, more or less the same as the original game, but just sped up. As the name would imply. And I think some of the characters had an extra special move,
Mm-hmm.
if memory serves.
Yeah, yeah. So they added extra moves and the obvious speed increase.
Yeah,
You could do faster speeds or all the way down to the regular speed. How'd you feel about going up levels in the turbo area of the game?
I preferred the original speed, but it sort of like was sort of akin to me as listening to a podcast at like 1.5 times, where you sort of feel like you have the experience, but just sped up. So I liked a lot about it, but it just ended up in me being beaten even quicker. So I generally prefer the original speed, but I definitely saw the allure or the reason why people would like the turbo edition.
Gotcha. Yeah, I kind of feel similarly. Like I would like to do maybe 1 star of turbo, but after that it's kind of a bit much.
Yeah, agreed.
And this Genesis version, it was the Champion Edition, but had, since it came out later, it had another mode. I think it was called Hyper Mode, that let you get some of those turbo updates. And the Super Nintendo Street Fighter II Turbo was the turbo game, but it also had the option to play sort of the Champion Edition speed. And
Right,
they
gotcha.
both had all the changes in the moves and stuff, which I think we're just all balancing. Like Chun-Li got a projectile, and Ken was like kind of differentiated from Ryu by having a different dragon punch that moved him a little bit forward, things like that to just kind of
Yeah.
balance and change and differentiate. But my favorite part of replaying came with the Street Fighter Collection 1 and 2 on the PlayStation and the Saturn. So these two, I mentioned it earlier, these ports were pretty much arcade perfect. And I ran a comparison between these and the Super Nintendo version. And when I went back and forth, I was just shocked at the differences, and I just got all of those memories of the visuals. This is where I got that visual memory when I was
Right. Yeah.
looking at the PlayStation and Saturn versions and seeing the graphics. It just really triggered something. I was like, oh wow, this is exactly what I was looking at when I
Yeah.
was a kid. They're bigger, they do more stuff, the hair moves, they
Yeah.
lean back when they're going backwards, you know, like kind of like backing off from their opponent. The moves are crisper and cleaner, the animations look good. It was just so cool. They had CD quality audio. The music is amazing. The music changes as you're going through the fights. It's like really crisp.
That's really cool.
Oh man, so so good. So let's talk about that Rainbow Edition a little bit. Tell me about that because I really don't know anything about it. What are some of like the real nitty gritty details you noticed?
Again, the big thing is that during the course of the game, as you're actually fighting, you could just switch your character just like immediately. You can swap them out, and I think
How do you
there were
do that?
probably a number.
What's
What's
like
that?
the command to do that?
I think in the arcade you could just hit like the start button and it would switch your character. And here I just had it mapped to a button as well. But I think you could just hit like player one or player two and it would swap out. Um, and again you could just cycle like mid jump. You could cycle your character if you wanted to. And I think there were like again from machine to machine, depending on which hacked version. I think there were some differences, but like for example, I remember one where you could, and this completely just broke the game. You could just like launch if you were Guile, you could launch. What was I forget the name of his
Sonic
range
Boom.
attack. The Sonic Boom, of course, yeah. I can't believe I forgot that. You could like just like line up Sonic Boom, so you could just attack with a like one of the light sonic booms, the ones that move slower across the screen, and you could
Hmm.
just have them like lined up. You could have a chain of them all sitting there on the screen, and it'd be impossible for your opponent to do anything because you just have a line of sonic booms just waiting for them.
Oh.
Um, and
And
there
you can do
was
that vertically too, right? Because you could do the
yeah.
projectiles in midair in that.
You could have like two levels of
That's
ranged
so messed
attacks,
up.
and yeah, it was completely broken, but just really crazy in terms of like all the ways that you could sort of manipulate the game and break the game. That there was some. I remember it not having a lot of staying power, but the novelty of it was really cool at the time.
Yeah. Man, that would be fun to get like my old friends together and just play that version and just
Yeah,
go
definitely.
crazy. Did you get to play with anyone?
No, not this time.
Yeah,
Not this
me
time.
either.
I was trying to get my brother to connect with me to bring up the old days, but I couldn't get it done.
Darn. What I did do though is I recently bought an arcade stick, mostly for this podcast because I thought it might be interesting to play some of the older games using an arcade stick.
Right.
And for a fighting game, it's perfect. So playing specifically those arcade perfect ports on the arcade stick
Oh, it must have
was
been
a
great.
sublime experience.
Sure.
It was just so good. And that's really what made me want to jump into a lot of the ensuing Capcom titles and see how I like those. You know, all the Marvel versus Capcoms and the this versus
Right.
Capcom and the Darkstalkers and everything, et cetera, et cetera. I'm really excited. This got me super excited for fighting games in general. Very cool. How was the music? Like we touched on it, but it's a big part of the game.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, the Guile theme song is iconic. Yeah, all that stuff. The music, the different locations, the graphics, and the music of the different locations is just such an integral part of the Street Fighter Two experience. Yeah,
Mm,
I love them. I love them.
yeah, that Guile theme is
Yeah,
among my favorite tracks in all of video gaming, and also
yeah,
like
for sure.
Ken and Ryu, really good music.
Yeah,
The majority of them, really. The Chun Li music in her level, which is like a crowded marketplace, a street
yeah.
in China.
Yeah,
They're
and
all
all the
so so
background
good.
graphics are just so cool. Like there's all these things going on. None of the backgrounds sort of like interact with the game as
Hmm.
far as I recall, but they were always moving and vibrant, and if
Yeah.
it sort of immersed you into the world.
Yeah. And speaking of backgrounds, in the original, there were breakable components on, I think, every level, like boxes on Guile stage or the sign on Ryu stage or some barrels or whatever on different stages. And those were there in the original, and then they got taken out in some of the later games. But then it was nice to see them again in some of those better ports. That was just another fun nostalgic trip, was sending people through those things. I don't know if
Right.
it increases damage for that first time. It might. I'm
Yeah, I
not
don't know.
sure. I wish I were more of an expert. Actually, as someone who is not an aficionado and not super well versed and doesn't have all the knowledge, I really found it super interesting to look at some of the characters and see how their moves changed and how things varied over time. You said you played Super Street Fighter 2, the
Yes.
new challengers, as kind of the majority this time.
So this was one that I didn't really play too much back in the day, and now I played it basically just to try out the characters that I wasn't super familiar with. So T
Hmm.
Hawk and DJ and them. So characters Cammy that were added later. Mainly played it to play those characters because I hadn't played them very much when it first came out. So it was fun trying those guys out.
Yeah, what'd you think of them? Did you have a particular favorite? Did they stand up to the old characters?
I mean, so not especially. I mean, I liked the look of the characters. DJ and T Hawk being the really big characters and uh, sort of blending well with the backgrounds and just evocative and Cammy feeling like a Street Fighter. The most I think to me like an original Street Fighter 2 character. But you know, these were characters I was playing for the first time in a long time, and even back then, like I said, I hadn't played them very much, so didn't really have the bond that I did with the original characters. So
Mm,
yeah, I wasn't really as plugged in with them, just because you know, the original Street Fighter characters, like even though I hadn't played the game in over a decade at that point, maybe a decade and a half or 2 decades. I knew the moves like muscle memory. I had
hmm.
all those moves. Even when I didn't know I had the moves, like I would start playing with somebody and then just realize like, oh, I know exactly how to do all these special moves. With T Hawk and Fei Long and DJ and Cammy, like I had to look them up and once
Right,
you look
just
them
like
up.
the first time when you played the other
Exactly, yeah,
characters back in the day.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I remember having that experience because, like I said, that was the one that I bought for myself. But I also remember getting that game feeling like it just felt a little different. And I wasn't as into some of the way that it felt at first compared to what I was used to. And the
Yeah.
new characters to me, when I first saw them, seemed like they didn't match perfectly. Like the scale
Yeah.
of them was a little off or something.
Right.
And I was noticing that again this time, but it wasn't as bad as what I remembered in the Super Nintendo versions and comparing to one another. I think maybe there was a greater change between the arcade and Super Nintendo version of Super Street Fighter, more so than there was with the other one.
Right.
But the biggest change that I noticed was playing Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which I didn't realize was a thing until recently. I
Right.
didn't know that they went beyond Super Street Fighter 2 and turbofied it.
I remember this one mainly for Akuma. I remember Akuma being a big thing, like
Mm,
hearing about this like M Bison esque character who was like this shadowy. I remember people talking about Akuma being a character even before this game came out, and it was like, no, you can't play as Akuma, and then finding out that in Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo they made Akuma a playable character, and thinking that was really cool. I remember some talk about like if you look at the background of the M Bison stage, like the final
hmm.
stage, there's like a shadowy character. And I remember friends of mine would say like, "Oh, I was at an arcade and I saw this guy and he like beat M. Bison perfectly, and then like a character came out of the audience, and it was this Akuma thing, and I don't remember. I think maybe
Yeah.
this game had been announced, and then this Akuma character popped up everywhere. But I just remember there being like a mythology to the character, and then all of a sudden being able to play him.
Yeah, as far as I understand, he was incredibly difficult to access in the early games. Like now he's just a character in the
Right.
modern Street Fighters, but I think it was if you beat the game in a certain amount of time without losing or using continues and you got to M. Bison, he would come out and kind of dispose of M. Bison, and then you'd have to fight him.
Right.
But I didn't get a chance to do that because that's hard. So you
Yeah.
played this time around. You played both Super Street Fighter 2 and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, or just one or the
Yeah.
other?
Both of them. Yeah.
So did you notice the differences? I felt like there were more differences between Super Turbo and Super than any of the others before that, like in the different animations and the way they did moves and stuff. Did you find that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It
I
seems
definitely.
like
I
it was
definitely.
very, very intentionally reworked for balance and competition.
Yeah.
Because like they
Right.
took away some moves that I recall using a lot. Like Blanca used to have this punch where if he was crouching and you did a strong punch, he would do this sort of uppercut that went halfway across the screen, and that's gone in that one. A lot of Guile's moves have changed all throughout, and he's super different in Super Turbo.
Right.
Ken's animations are very different and like updated. Really interesting. Did you like that one as much, better, less than the others?
I mean, my heart is still with the original ones, but I think this was among my favorites of the offshoots.
Yeah.
It just like you said, it sort of did feel reworked from the ground up, and you could sort of sense the care that had gone into balancing and sort of getting everything just right.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. That's exactly how I felt. Really good too. Like I felt
Yeah. Oh
really
yeah.
happy playing it. Like it was a brand new experience, and it felt very well tuned, and
Yeah.
I just felt
Agreed.
good. I felt successful, I think, because of the ways that it was updated. Although that one adds that super meter, and I don't know how
Oh
you ever
right.
use
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. I I think I was able to get it going, but yeah, I do remember that being a big difference, obviously, from the other ones. This is the first game from the series, right? That includes that super
Yeah.
combo meter. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely the only Street Fighter 2 version, and Capcom added that in many
Yeah.
of their future games, and other companies added that in many of their future games. But I know that the super moves are oftentimes like a double joystick move that is similar to one of that character's regular moves. But my
Right.
issue was that every time my super meter was filled, I had already defeated my opponent. It
Oh
fills
right.
so
Right.
slowly.
Yeah.
I never had the chance.
Yeah. I remember not being able to do it that often, but it was really cool when you could
That's
get
really
it just
weird.
right.
But interestingly, I also felt like at the same time, like despite that, the energy bars of the characters depleted a little bit more slowly than in older games, according to just my gut feeling.
Yeah, I think so. That feels right.
Mm. So like longer matches, I guess.
Yeah.
Probably they
Yeah.
realize people are really good at this game, so we don't want the fights to be over in 1 second.
Yeah.
Of course, I was never on that level.
Right, right. But yeah, no, it definitely seemed like the power, the energy was going down. I mean, I remember in some of the older games, like you really could chunk people's energies in big pieces. Whereas with this last one, it definitely felt like it's more incremental.
So to wrap it up, I guess I'm just gonna see if you have any other specific elements or favorite parts or parts that you didn't like maybe is more interesting, or any notable moments in this replay that you definitely want people to hear about.
There wasn't much that I didn't like. This was really really fun. Again, I was never like a really quick twitch player. Like fighting games in general weren't my thing because I just didn't excel at them. But going back and trying these was really really fun. I mean, again, it just the games seem to sort of satisfy a lot of different things you want in a fighting game. Like again, if you want to fight like with a brawler, you could go with a Blanca or a Honda, and then you Dalsum who stretches across the screen, and Chun Li and the more agile character. So it feels like whatever style you want to fight in, you can do it. So I just had a blast playing this again for sure.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I tried out a lot of characters that I otherwise wouldn't have played as in the past. Like I used to when I had Super Street Fighter 2, I would always be Sagat because
Right.
I felt like he was overpowered. And this time I didn't really use him. I tried out some others. I also
Yeah.
dabbled in some Chun-Li for this play. That was fun because she's an interesting character. I thought to myself like, okay, Chun-Li is one of the longest running characters. She's sort of at the forefront of the lore. She got her own cartoon show at some point. Let me try out Chun-Li. She's probably good.
Yeah.
And I found out, oh yeah, she's legit, especially in Super Turbo. Well, Super Turbo being the one that I think everyone's pretty legit in. It really makes it fun to play every character,
Yeah.
which is my
Anybody.
favorite thing
Right.
about that. Cool.
Definitely.
Okay. So, I think this is obvious at this point, but with every game, or in this case, set of games, this is the Street Fighter 2 suite we're kind of reviewing here. We like to give final thoughts. Is the game worth replaying? Is it worth spending time going back? Would you recommend it to people? And ultimately, would you call it more of a smash or more of a brick? So, Mark Besada, Street Fighter 2, what do you say?
Yeah, I don't think I'm breaking any new ground here, but it is a huge smash. I was really excited for the episode. I was a little wary because again, I was never a great player myself, and so I was worried that actually playing them, would sort of take the shine off of these like memories I had. But it was like quite the contrary. I loved them. Makes me want to play them more. Makes me want to dive into like this crazy lore that I've been reading about. So yeah, big time smash in my opinion.
Yeah, same. Same. Big smash.
Yeah.
And even though I knew that I loved the game in the past, over time, that affinity has sort of faded as I've grown further and further apart from that experience. So this was another instance, kind of like with the GoldenEye episode, where I got into it, and as I kept playing, it just kept coming back to me, and the feelings kept coming back. The nostalgia grew and grew, and just the sheer joy of playing kept rising in me. And it was a fantastic experience, especially when I learned about all the different collections and the new versions. Like the one that I spent the most time with was the Saturn version of the Street Fighter collection and Super Turbo. And especially now that I have this arcade stick, just that whole combination is a way bigger smash than I would have even expected. So yeah, 100% smash for me.
Awesome. I'll have to seek out that version specifically and try it out.
Yeah, I did a little Twitch stream that was interesting to me where I just switched back and forth between the different versions like Super Nintendo to
Oh,
Saturn.
cool.
And I also did a little bit of a comparison between the load times of the PS1 and the Saturn. And it kind of shows the differences in how it looks and how it plays. And it just helped me land on that Saturn version. Really cool.
That's
And
awesome.
I'm not a Saturn fan. Like I just talked all the trash about the Genesis, but then came right back and now I say that the Saturn was the best way to play, even though I had a
Huh.
PS1 and never had a Saturn. So
Right.
that was really cool to discover for me. I like that. And of course, some of the newer versions are probably better. I just didn't have access to those for this.
Right.
Anyway, that's Street Fighter 2, almost all versions. Thanks for playing and coming on and talking about it. There was so much information there. I felt like we were cruising through everything, and it's
Right. No,
nuts.
it was fun. It was a blast. I absolutely loved it. Thanks for having me on this episode. I don't feel worthy of it, but it was great.
Yeah, I don't feel worthy of this episode either, to be honest. Like there's always this feeling about fighting games or other competitive genres where you almost
Sure.
feel like you have to be of a certain skill level to be worthy of speaking about it.
Discussing it. Yeah, makes sense.
But, we're casuals, filthy casuals,
Sure.
and we can be.
Right.
They're retro games. I'm not trying to go to Evo or, any of
Right.
the big fighting game competitions, so
Competitions.
it's
Yeah.
fine. And I think most of the listeners probably aren't either. I'm sure many of them could beat me, though. All right, so you already mentioned where to find you. You said boardgamebarrage.com, right? And anywhere
Right.
fine podcasts are sold.
Absolutely. Exactly.
Cool. And now for one of the most exciting moments of the episode, I can reveal our next game and my next guest. That's going to be returning guest Kyle Stallock, and we will be playing the classic 1993 point and click adventure game, Myst. So
Awesome.
get your hands on that game and play along and be ready for next episode. I can give you a hot tip that it's $5.99 on Steam for the Myst Masterpiece Edition. Now, links to everything I'm about to mention can easily be found at linktr.ee/smashingbricks. That's Linktree Smashing Bricks, linktr.ee/smashing bricks. But speaking of upcoming games, we have the Smashing Bricks retro games list that you can go and take a look at. And you can always make suggestions for games that you'd like to see played, whether they are on or not on that list. And you can do that by emailing into smashingbrickspodcast@gmail.com. I've also set up a Discord server for all of you retro gamers to come and join us in chatting about the upcoming games, the games that have passed, your dinner, your lunch, random video games, board games, news, politics, whatever. That is on the Discord server. You can find an invitation link in the show notes and also at the link tree. And that is totally free and easy to set up on your phone or computer with a small app. So feel free to join us there. That's a lot of fun. We're pretty small now, but we will continue to grow. And speaking of growing, I do have a number of social media platforms you can follow on, like Instagram at Smashing Bricks, youtube.com/Smashing Bricks, twitter.com at Smashing_Bricks. And now I do have a Twitch channel at twitch.tv/Smashing Bricks Podcast. And I've already gone ahead and recorded a few things there with VODs that will be uploaded both on Twitch and YouTube, and some will even be available as exclusives for certain tiers on the Patreon page. Again, I have a Patreon where you can go and support the show at $1, $5, $20, or more for various different perks. One really cool one being that $5 Fireflower tier, where you get to make submissions for the upcoming Patreon Picks episodes, where instead of choosing games myself with my guest, I will choose a game from the Patreon submitted games. So you will have a very high chance of having your game played. And if you are among the first to get in and do that, it's almost a guarantee that your game is going to get played. So please do go check out patreon.com/smashingbricks. I really appreciate any and all support that you can give there. And even if you can't donate monetarily right now, that's no big deal. I still love you. I still love doing the show. And there is a very free and very easy way you can help a lot. And that is by going to your podcasting platform of choice or multiple ones. Apple Podcasts is very helpful. Spotify is great, but I'm on numerous others which you can check out. Just take a few minutes to go and leave a 5-star rating and review on any of those, and that would be amazing and be super helpful for the show. Thank you. Anyway, thanks again, Mark. It was a joy having you on. I really appreciate your time and your history. It was fun to listen to.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Awesome. And for everyone else, I will see you next time. And until then, may the nostalgia be with you.